Hi, Mrs. B here. Let's review for the Chapter 2 test. Remember to pause the video, try each problem, and then play the video to check your answers with mine. Here we go. Okay, let's write numbers in different forms and compare them. So for the first number 2, any number that's farther to the right on the number line would be greater. So our first number is farther to the right, therefore greater. For number 3, our numbers are written in different forms, so we would have to turn one into the other form, and it's easier to turn the fraction into the decimal. So let's take our fraction and turn it into a decimal by dividing. So 16 divided by 11, we have one group of 11, and we have to subtract that. And we have 5 left over. We're going to bring down a 0. So now we have 50 divided by 11, and that goes in 4 times. 4 times 11 is 44. We're going to have 6 left over. Bring down another 0. Running out of room. So we have 60 divided by 11, which is 5. I'm not going to keep doing it, but the pattern is going to continue, which means it's the exact same number, so they're equal to each other. Number 2, let's change our fraction into a decimal. A denominator of 5 is an easy denominator, so we can make that easily into -1 6/10, which we would write as -1.6. Our second number is not as easy because our denominator is 40. So we have to do long division in order to change that into a decimal. So we're doing 3 divided by 40. See how I set up that problem? So we have 30. See where our decimal is, but now it's 30 divided by 40, and that does not go into it. So we would put a 0 in the tens place, and then we can keep adding zeros, and now we have 300 divided by 40, which does go into it 7 times. So 40 times 7 is 280. So that's what we're going to subtract. And we're going to have 20 left over. So we bring down another 0. And we would have 200 divided by 40, which is 5. Now don't forget to write the complete answer, which is -5.0.75. How'd you do with that one? And then our next 2 are changing our decimals into fractions. That's usually a little bit easier. Start by looking at what place the last number is in, and for 0.68, that's the hundredths place. So we start with 68 hundredths, and you can divide by 2 and then divide by 2, or divide by 4 right from the start, and you end up with our answer of 17/25. Okay, and our second one, the 5 is in the thousands place. So we start with 3 and 5 1,000ths. And we need to simplify that by dividing numerator and denominator by 5. So that ends up being 3 and 1 200th. And we are done with that one. Moving on. Okay. Number 15, to find a repeating decimal in between, let's write each fraction as a decimal. So we have -2.3 repeating. That should be one we just know by heart. And our second one should be pretty easy to turn into -2.2. So anything in between 0.2 and 0.33, say, and if it's repeating, would work. So an example of this would be -2.2 repeating, or -2 and 21 repeating, or -2.22, or so on. There's so many different answers in between. So let's compare these 2 lengths. So your fish and your friend's fish, did you know that's a kind of fish? I wrote them out, and they're very hard denominators to compare. So that's when we can really use our little trick of multiplying 13 times 5, and that fraction multiplies to be 65, and then we have 12 times 6, which is 72, and since 72 is greater than 65, that means your friend's snapper is a little bit longer. Okay, let's add and subtract fractions and decimals. So for our first one, okay, I'm just setting up the problem. We have different signs, so we have to subtract. I put the higher number first. Notice I added a 0 in the thousands place. So now we're just going to subtract. So in order to do so, we need to borrow, borrow, borrow. So in order to make this 10, this becomes a 5. And then in order to make this 15, this becomes a 2. Now we're good to go. We have enough to subtract. So we end up with a 5 and a 6 and a 2 and a 3. And then we have to ask ourselves what sign is our answer. And our higher number is positive, so this is our final answer. Okay, for our second one, we're adding two negatives together, so we just add. We need a common denominator of ninths. So we're good to go if we change negative 2 and a third into negative 2 and 3 ninths. So now we have 7 ninths and 3 ninths, so that would be 10 ninths. So this is what we have so far. We have negative 5 and 10 ninths. So we need to change that because we can't leave an improper fraction in it. So we take a whole out of our fraction, and now we have negative 6 and 1 ninth, and that's our final answer. Okay, let's find the perimeter of the rectangle. And we're adding all four sides together, kind of showing it to you so I don't run out of time. We added our two widths together, we get 10 and 2/3, and our two lengths together, we get 20 and 1/3. Add them up and they come to 31 inches. Okay, a little more practice with this. So for our first one, we're going to keep our first number, change this to adding a positive. So now we have different signs, so we subtract. So this is me setting it up, and now we just need to subtract. So we're going to borrow. So now we're good to go. We have 11 minus 8, 8 minus 2, and 7 minus 5. But our sign, don't forget to check at the end, and our higher number is negative, so that means our answer is also negative. Okay, so we're subtracting a negative for number 9, so that becomes adding a positive, so we're just adding. So first, I'm showing that, and then we need common denominators, which unfortunately I believe has to be 40, so let's add them now. We're good to go. So in our whole place we have 7, and in our fraction we have 46/40ths. And then we need to rename that. So we can take one whole out of our fraction, so that's 8, and we have 6/40ths left over, and 6/40ths becomes 3/20ths. Okay. If we're finding the distance between those two numbers, we need to subtract, and we put our negative 1 and 1/12 first. And we're taking away 8 3/8. So how we do that is we leave our first number and we turn this into adding a positive. So now we have to subtract. So we want to take, I really should stack them on top of each other, but we're taking 8 and 9/24 and subtracting 1 and 2/24. And 9/24 minus 2/24 ends up being 7/24, and 8 minus 1 is 7. So this is what we would end up with. It's positive because it's a distance. If you did end up subtracting in the other order and you got a negative, you would just write it as positive because distance is always positive. Okay, now we're on to multiplication and division. So when you see parentheses, that means to multiply. So I'm just stacking my two decimals. I'm ignoring the decimal signs till the very last step. My first place, I did 5 times 62, and my second row, I did 4 times 62. Now I'm just going to add. And since there are 2 decimal places in our factors, we go 2 places over. And our answer is not quite done till we check the sign. And since we're multiplying a positive times a negative, we have to remember the negative sign. And we don't need to write that 0 in the hundredths place. It's unnecessary. Number 8. When you're dividing fractions, we turn them into improper fractions first, and then we have to multiply by the reciprocal. And make your life easier by always checking to see if you can simplify first. And you can in this case. It can make a big difference because first, let's look at 10 and 5. They can each be divisible by 5, so we now have a 2 and a 1. And 18 and 27 are each divisible by 9. So we have a 2 and a 3. Now it's like a super easy problem of 4 over 3, but our answer is going to be negative, and I'm going to write it as a mixed number. So this ends up being negative 1 1/3. Okay, let's look at number 9. I already turned each fraction into an improper fraction, and again I'm going to remember to cross simplify. So 25 and 5, I'm dividing out by 5, and 18 and 6, I'm dividing by 6. And again, look at our signs. We have a negative times a negative, so our answer will be positive 15. Okay, number 10, we're dividing decimals. We need to make our divisor a whole number. So we're moving the decimal over 1 to the right, so we need to do the same in our dividend and move it up into our answer. So it ends up being 27 divided by 9, which is 3. And then the last thing, or the first thing, whichever you prefer to do, is to look at our signs again. And we have a negative divided by a positive, so our quotient is negative. So that would be our answer. Okay, the stock market change. When you see changed by 2 1/3 of that amount, that means to multiply by that number. So we're seeing what 2 1/3 of this number is. These numbers get really big in this one. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so I found it easier because this would be a repeating decimal. That's pretty hard to multiply by. So I turned both numbers into fractions, and then I turned them into improper fractions and cross-simplified, and I end up with negative 133 over 10. So when I divide 133 by 10, I end up with 13.3. So that actually would end up being a negative number because it was a negative times a positive. Okay. In the table, we're adding up our transactions to see what our balance is and all said and done. So I recommend doing your positive numbers separate than your negative. So you can see my work and compare it with yours. And then when I finish, I just add my positive to my negative, and I get 9.42. And for the second question, You're adding the 75.5 on to get the final answer. One more. Okay. When you're taking the test, please draw a pumpkin on the end of your test so that if you want to get 2 bonus points, you can get bonus points by doing that. So here's our last one. The trick to this is after you take a sip and you have 9/10 left, that means you drank 1/10. So we want to find out what 1/10 of 16.9 is. So that means to multiply by a tenth. And when you multiply by a tenth, all you're doing is dividing by 10. So we're just moving the decimal over one place. So our final answer is 1.69 fluid ounces. Okay, please do these problems again if you had any trouble, but hopefully this will help you and you'll have good success on your tests. Take care.